So this morning, I want to confess a temptation. Have all of your attention now. This is something I've shared before, but it turns out it's an ongoing kind of besetting temptation. It comes up when I'm in a social situation with people I don't know, and maybe like a dinner party or a wedding or something. And like people do in small talk, we start to describe what it is that we do. And, so I'll hear Steve talk about his job in accounting, and we'll move around the circle to Sally, who has a new job at HR. And I just am feeling so jealous of these normal people and their normal jobs. And I'm starting to feel anxious because I know that it's coming around to me, and this nice conversation is about to go south really quick. And so I try to think about how to manage the nuclear bomb that it is to say, oh, I'm a pastor. And so I confess to you that I spend some time sometimes trying to think about what's a way I can describe what I do without really saying it. Can I just say I'm in communications? Or maybe community development? That would work, right? Or nonprofit management? Sometimes I feel like it would be better to just say that I'm totally unemployed. That the conversation would go much better. But I'm confessing this because I realize that actually this is a form of hypocrisy, this temptation. And nobody likes a hypocrite. And most of the time, when we think about hypocrisy, we think about somebody who is trying to pretend to be someone that they're not. But this form of hypocrisy that I'm talking about is the kind where you pretend to not be who you are. And Jesus has no patience for either of them. In Luke 11, which is right before where we're going to look together today, he's at a dinner with the Pharisees, some Pharisees, which were like the religious leaders of his time. They were apparently not afraid of saying what they did. They loved it because he is laying into them in this dinner. For example, he says, "Woe to you, Pharisees, because you love the most important seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplace. Woe to you, because you are like unmarked graves, which people walk over without knowing it." I confess I don't totally understand what that means. That seems like some fairly obscure shade he's throwing at them. But they get it because it says in verse 45 of chapter 11, one of the experts of the law answered him. I love this. "Teacher, when you say these things, you insult us also." Like Jesus, we're right here. We can hear you. But he doesn't stop. In chapter 12, he goes on in this theme of human hypocrisy and the various ways it works itself out. Both the kind of hypocrisy that pretends to be what you're not and the kind of hypocrisy that pretends to not be what you are. And he calls us away from all of it. And in a sense, he says that we are invited to go all in for Jesus because he has gone all in for us. So we're going to read chapter 12, the first 12 verses in 3 sections. We're going to start in verse 1, where we read this. "Meanwhile, when a crowd of many thousands had gathered, so that they were trampling on one another, Jesus began to speak first to his disciples, saying, 'Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. There is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. What you have said in the dark will be heard in the daylight, and what you have whispered in the ear in the inner rooms will be proclaimed from the roofs.'" So if you're one of Jesus' disciples right now, things are going well for you. You're like a rock star. There's literally people who are trampling over each other to get near you. I bet that at this moment, they are thinking, we made a really good decision when we decided to leave our job as fishermen to follow Jesus. But Jesus has some words of warning for them as they move into this new kind of popularity, you might say. He is warning them that along with this notoriety comes a kind of pressure. And the pressure will be to pretend to be more than they are or to pretend to be other than they are. He says, beware the yeast of the Pharisees, which is hypocrisy. Now, this is kind of the first form of hypocrisy where these Pharisees love to appear better than they were, to pretend, to posture at being pious and holy and scholarly. They were at the top of the social pecking order, and they liked it that way. And so they worked really hard to keep it that way. But Jesus, again in chapter 11, says that what often happens in this situation is that you are like a cup that's really clean on the outside, but on the inside, which is where the important stuff goes, it's rotten and disgusting. And so he says one of the things that happens, one of the things you need to be aware of as you move into this new place, he says this to his disciples. He says, everything that is concealed will be disclosed. There is nothing that is not hidden that will not be made known. In our day, this sounds like prophecy, right? Like he was telling the future. Because we're in a time where emails get leaked and pictures get screenshot and forwarded around. We live in a time when, for good and for ill, everything that's been whispered behind closed doors has a way of getting out into the open. And in a lot of ways, this is a good thing. It exposes hypocrisy of people around us, the people that we look up to. And so it's easy for us to think about this and think about the latest political scandal or celebrity gossip or church leader. But I think if we're honest with ourselves, this kind of thing probably strikes some fear in all of our hearts. There is not one of us that would like to have everything we've ever said out in the public. And the reason for that is because all of us, to some degree or another, don't match up to what we present and project to the world around us. So this idea of everything that we've ever said, all of a sudden being out there in the light of day, probably sounds to you like a literal nightmare. And I think Jesus knows that because he then goes to start to talk about fear. In verse 4, he says, I tell you, my friends, do not be afraid of those who kill the body and after that can do no more. But I will show you whom you should fear. Fear him who, after your body has been killed, has authority to throw you into hell. Yes, I tell you, fear him. Are not 5 sparrows sold for 2 pennies? Yet not one of them is forgotten by God. Indeed, the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Do not be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. So if you're reading along here, I wouldn't blame you if you felt like you had a little bit of whiplash. Because on the one hand, Jesus sounds a little bit like, that the only sermon that anybody reads in high school called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, where Jonathan Edwards imagines us as like these little bugs, these little spiders being held over a flame by a God who's really pretty upset with us and is almost at the end of his patience. That's part of what Jesus is saying. And there's part of that that's true. It's not in the direction of spiritual health to forget that God is God, that he is majestic and mighty and transcendent and has authority over our eternal souls. When we forget that, we start moving in bad directions. In the same way that it is good to respect and awe the power of a hurricane, it is also important for our spiritual health to remember the majesty of God. And yet, at the very same time, in just a few short verses, he talks not only about this kind of frightening, majestic power of God, but he also speaks in some of the most tender and beautiful ways about God's love and care for us. This hurricane of a God is also a God that knows every single sparrow and every single hair on your head. And the message that he ends this little paragraph with is, so don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. I think the reason Jesus is doing this is because at some level he knows that much of our hypocrisy is rooted in some kind of fear. Right? We're afraid that if we don't impress people, that they'll reject us. If we show who we really are, then all we'll be met with is condemnation and shame. And so we try to dress it up and curate an image to project so that people will accept us, but it's really that we're just afraid of being rejected. Or, on the other hand, we're worried that people will want to stop talking to us at the dinner party when they find out that we're a weird religious pastor, and so we spend a lot of energy trying to figure out how to avoid that situation so that people will still like you. But what Jesus, I think, is saying here, if you put this together, is that when we see God in all of his might and power, we remember that there is no one else that we should fear. And when we see God in his mercy and his grace, we realize that we have nothing to fear. God, in his power and might, reminds us that he's the only opinion that matters. And God, in his mercy and grace, reminds us that he already knows everything we've ever said. He knows every hair on our heads. And because he's a God of mercy and grace, we do not need to be afraid. So I wonder how much of your energy, how much of your time, how much of your emotional life is spent kind of trying to create this version of you to manage the fear that you won't be accepted. Maybe it's among your teammates and your classmates. Maybe it's among your colleagues, your coworkers. Maybe it's with your family and friends. A lot of us spend a lot of time trying to pretend to not be what we are or to pretend to be what we're not as a way of managing this kind of fear. Jesus is inviting us to a whole different way of thinking, of understanding who God is, and being released from that fear to be who we really are. Because the God who knows us more intimately than we even know ourselves is a God who is saying to us, you don't have anything to be afraid of. In this passage, he then goes on to start to talk a little bit more about that second kind of hypocrisy. He tells them to be aware of the first kind of hypocrisy that the Pharisees are known for, trying to be what you're not. But then he shifts to the second kind, where you try to not be what you are, because he knows that as his disciples grow in their notoriety, that this attention they're going to get is going to turn. And all of a sudden, they're going to be under pressure to deny their friendship with Jesus, to deny the fact that they're following after him. And this is a reality that has presented itself in life or death sorts of situations for Christians throughout time and in lots of places in the world today. And so I imagine that this verse is extremely powerful to many who try to follow Jesus in circumstances of persecution. Verse 8 says, I tell you, whoever publicly acknowledges me, the Son of Man will also acknowledge before the angels of God. But whoever publicly disowns me will be disowned before the angels of God. And everyone who speaks a word against the Son of Man will be forgiven, but anyone who blasphemes against the Holy Spirit will not be forgiven. When you are brought before synagogues, rulers, and authorities, do not worry about how you will defend yourselves or what you will say, for the Holy Spirit will teach you at that time what you should say. So these words, too, are a lot like the last ones we saw, right? Where it's sort of an incredible promise and also something that sounds kind of ominous. There's this talk about blaspheming the Holy Spirit and that is an unforgivable sin, and then he ends by saying, but don't be afraid, the Holy Spirit's going to be with you in whatever circumstance you find yourself in. So what's going on here? How do we hold these things in tension like we did in the last section? Well, the first thing to say, I think, about this idea of blasphemy of the Holy Spirit, this unforgivable sin, is to say that if you're worried about it, you probably don't need to worry about it. This is not like a kind of accident that you can stumble into, like you leave your dome light on in your car and your battery's gone the next morning. It's not like that. It's a much more significant thing. But what is it? What does it mean? Well, I found some help this week from perhaps an unlikely source, from a book, an old book called The Institutes of the Christian Religion by John Calvin, the patron saint of the Presbyterian Church. Perhaps not one you might think of when you think of the warm Holy Spirit and his work in your life, but stay tuned, because he's actually really helpful. Here's what John Calvin says about this idea. He says, we must understand that as long as Christ remains outside of us and we are separated from him, all that he has suffered and done for the salvation of the human race remains useless and of no value to us. The Holy Spirit is the bond by which Christ effectually unites us to himself. So what does that mean? He's saying that everything that Christ did there and then, the only way that it is communicated to us, that it gets transferred over to us, that it becomes real in our own lives, is through the work of the Holy Spirit. It's the Holy Spirit by which the grace, the mercy, the forgiveness moves from what Jesus did back there and then to our lives here and now. And so if we are pushing away the Holy Spirit in our lives, what we are ultimately pushing away is everything that Christ won for us and wants to give to us through the Holy Spirit. So if you push away the work of forgiveness that Christ has won for you, you are pushing away forgiveness. So it's maybe not so much like this sneaky penalty, like a trap that God has set for us, so much as it is a just description of how forgiveness works and how we receive it or not. Like if you don't open your eyes, you won't see the sunrise. Ladies and gentlemen, John Calvin. Let's hear it for him. So we have this same promise in the midst of these hard words, a promise that God will be with us by the power of his Holy Spirit, even in circumstances when we don't know what to do anymore, when we don't know what to say, when the pressure has come, when we are exposed, when we're at the end of our rope. The message here is, don't be afraid. I will be with you. I will help you. I will supply what you need. This is the message that I think frees us from the kind of anxious posturing and pretending that so characterizes our lives. This is what can set us free to be all in for Jesus. Because we realize that he was all in for us and the Holy Spirit is all in for us, which is not to say that it's not serious, right? There's some hard words in this passage. There's no games. Jesus isn't here for any of these games, any of this pretending, any of this posturing. But he's inviting us to live as full people, all in, everything that we are, holding nothing back, fearing nothing, no one else, because we know that we have nothing to fear in him, because Jesus went all in for us. Right? He embodied what he describes here. He already knows every word we've ever whispered in the darkness. He knows every thought that's been on our hearts, and yet there is no one who thinks more often or more highly of you. He is the one who laid aside his power and went into punishment for us. It was said that he descended into hell. So Jesus isn't one who uses his power to threaten us. He's one who lays it aside in order to free us. And he's the one who went before rulers and authorities on our behalf. And the words he spoke were, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they do." He said, "It is finished," which means all of our work of trying to prove ourselves, of pretending to be what we're not, pretending to not be what we are, all of that can be finished as well. We can follow with all that we are, all that we've done, because he's promised to be there, to be with us, whatever comes.